There is a plant that has been on this earth for longer than recorded history. It grew in the soil of every continent. Every ancient civilization that left written records behind mentioned it. Egyptian papyri described it as a treatment for inflammation. Persian physicians prescribed it for pain and fever. Chinese medical texts from before the Common Era listed it as one of the foundational medicines. Indigenous healers across every continent arrived at the same conclusions independently across thousands of years and thousands of miles of separation, because the evidence was impossible to ignore. And then, in 1910, a single report changed everything. Not a discovery, not a new science, a report, funded by money that had already decided what it wanted the conclusion to be, distributed to every medical school in the country and used to reshape the entire structure of Western medicine in a span of roughly 15 years. The plant did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because it was too effective, too cheap, and too available to be profitable. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a sequence of documented events, real names, real dates, and a pattern so consistent that you will have a very hard time explaining it as coincidence by the time we are done. Let us start at the beginning. Not 1910. Much further back than that. Chapter 1. The Ancient Record. If you go looking for the earliest mentions of hemp, which is cannabis sativa, in the botanical record, you find references that stretch back to approximately 2700 BCE in Chinese pharmacopoeia, attributed to the Emperor Shen Nong, who is also credited as the father of Chinese agriculture. He described it as a treatment for over 100 ailments, including gout, malaria, absent-mindedness, and what the translations describe as female weakness, which modern researchers believe referred to menstrual disorders and inflammation. That is not a folk remedy. That is a documented clinical observation from a civilization that had been practicing medicine systematically for centuries, before that text was written down. In ancient Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 BCE, contains references to cannabis preparations applied topically for inflammation. The Ramessean Papyri, even older, mention it in the context of treating the eyes. These are not spiritual texts. They are medical instructions written by people who were keeping records of what worked. The Atharva Veda, one of the 4 sacred texts of ancient India, lists cannabis as one of 5 sacred plants and describes it as a source of happiness and a liberator of anxiety. Ayurvedic practitioners used it for pain, digestive disorders, and what they called wasting diseases. That last category, wasting diseases, is particularly significant. We will come back to that. Across every civilization that left records, hemp appears, not occasionally, not as an outlier, as a constant. A plant so universally recognized as medicinal that cultures with no contact with each other arrived at the same conclusions. That does not happen with plants that do not work. Chapter 2. What was being treated? Before we talk about what was taken away, it helps to understand what it was being used for. Pain management, fever reduction, inflammation of every kind, digestive disorders including nausea and cramping, neurological conditions including seizures, sleep disorders, anxiety, respiratory conditions, skin conditions and infected wounds, and wasting diseases, the historical term for conditions where the body fails to maintain weight and muscle mass, which modern medicine recognizes in cancer patients, AIDS patients, and severe Crohn's disease. The plant was not being used as a cure-all. It was being used specifically, targeted to specific symptoms by practitioners with generations of observational data behind them. By the 1800s, cannabis tinctures were a standard product in every pharmacy. Queen Victoria's personal physician, Sir J. Russell Reynolds, prescribed cannabis to her and wrote in The Lancet in 1890 that it was one of the most valuable medicines in his clinical experience. Park, Davis and Company, now part of Pfizer, manufactured and sold cannabis extracts commercially. Squibb and Eli Lilly produced cannabis-based medicines openly sold across the country. In 1850, cannabis was added to the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official list of recognized medicines. It stayed on that list for 90 years, used by royal physicians, manufactured by companies that are still household names today, and then, within a single generation, gone. Illegal, dangerous, a threat to public health. What changed? Chapter 3. The Flexner Report and the money behind it. In 1908, Abraham Flexner was commissioned to survey medical education in the United States. Flexner was not a doctor. He was a former schoolteacher with no medical training. The commission came from the Carnegie Foundation. The funding behind it came largely from John D. Rockefeller, who had already built Standard Oil into the largest corporation in American history and was consolidating his interests in pharmaceuticals. Rockefeller's connection to pharmaceuticals is direct. His business partner, Friedrich Bayer, yes, that Bayer, had helped establish the model for synthetic petrochemical-derived medicine in Germany. Rockefeller understood that plants could not be patented. Anyone could grow them. Anyone could prepare them. There was no monopoly in a weed that grew in every field. Synthetic compounds were different. You could patent a molecule, you could control the supply chain, you could require facilities that only large corporations could build. Medicine could become an industry with barriers to entry that guaranteed profit. The Flexner Report, published in 1910, concluded that most American medical schools were inadequate and needed to be reformed. The report recommended standardizing medical education around a German university model that emphasized laboratory science, physiology, and biochemistry. It recommended defunding and closing schools that focused on botanical medicine, homeopathy, naturopathy, and other traditional practices. Between 1910 and 1935, the number of medical schools in the United States dropped from 155 to 31. The schools that survived were the ones that received Carnegie and Rockefeller funding. The ones that closed were overwhelmingly the ones that taught botanical and traditional medicine. The physicians who were trained in those traditions retired without replacements. Within 20 years, an entire branch of medical knowledge that had been accumulating for centuries was effectively erased from the official curriculum. This is not a theory. These are documented closures, documented funding sources, documented policy outcomes. You can find the Flexner Report in any major university library. You can cross-reference the dates of school closures with the distribution of Carnegie and Rockefeller grants. The paper trail is real. Chapter 4. The Tartarian Medicine Question. Here is where the history gets deeper and more uncomfortable. There is a growing body of researchers who believe that the suppression of botanical medicine in 1910 was not the beginning of a project. It was the conclusion of one. The Tartarian hypothesis, for those who are coming to it fresh, holds that the world we were told about, the narrative of slow linear progress from primitive peoples to modern civilization, is not accurate. That there existed, prior to the 1800s, a global civilization of significant sophistication, one that left behind architectural evidence that we can still see today in the anomalous buildings of the 19th century that no surviving construction techniques can fully explain, and one that understood natural medicine at a level we are only now beginning to approach. The botanical medicine tradition in this framework is not a primitive precursor to real medicine. It is a remnant, a fragment of a far more complete system of knowledge that was deliberately dismantled, first through the events of the mid-1800s that the Tartarian researchers identify as the reset, and then again through institutional mechanisms like the Flexner Report, which finished what the reset began by cutting the institutional memory of those who had preserved what survived. Consider that the endocannabinoid system, the network of receptors in the human body that cannabis compounds directly interact with, was not officially described until 1992. The human body has a dedicated receptor system for compounds found in this plant, regulating pain, mood, immune response, appetite, and sleep. The body evolved to work with it. Or, in the Tartarian framework, the people before the reset already understood this relationship because they never lost the knowledge that we are now slowly recovering. And then it was taken away. Chapter 5. The Harrison Act, the Marijuana Tax Act, and how you erase a plant. The Flexner Report reshaped medical education, but it did not make cannabis illegal. That took a separate set of moves, each one building on the last, each one using a different justification, but all of them arriving at the same destination. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 was framed as a revenue measure, a tax on opium and coca derivatives, but it established the federal mechanism to regulate and restrict substances. That precedent mattered. Then came Harry Anslinger. Anslinger was appointed as the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930. A former prohibitionist who watched his funding base collapse when alcohol prohibition ended in 1933, he needed a new target. His campaign against cannabis was built almost entirely on fabricated stories of violence and racial contamination, sourced from tabloid newspapers portraying the plant as a drug that turned users, particularly users of color, into criminals. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 effectively banned cannabis by imposing a tax so burdensome that any legal transaction became economically impossible. The American Medical Association opposed the act. Dr. William Woodward testified before Congress that the medical profession had not been consulted, that cannabis had legitimate medical applications, and that the legislation was both unnecessary and harmful. He was publicly ridiculed by the committee chairman. His testimony was dismissed. The pharmaceutical industry did not oppose the act. By 1942, cannabis had been removed from the United States Pharmacopoeia. The medicine that had been on the official list since 1850 was gone. 92 years of official recognition erased in a 5-year legislative sprint. The wording used in all of this legislation is also worth noting. The word marijuana, spelled in a deliberately Spanish-inflected way, was used specifically to distance the legislation from the word cannabis and hemp, which Americans associated with medicine and rope making. If Congress had voted on banning cannabis preparations, physicians and farmers would have recognized it immediately. Marijuana sounded foreign, dangerous, and connected to populations that white lawmakers in 1937 were already predisposed to fear. The renaming was deliberate. You can track when Anslinger started using it. It was a campaign decision. Chapter 6. What the research has found. Since here is the part that makes everything else worse. In 1996, California became the first state to legalize medical cannabis. That opened a door, slowly and imperfectly, for researchers to begin studying the plant with modern tools. What they found over the following 30 years was not surprising to anyone who had read the historical record. But it was extraordinary by the standards of what pharmaceutical science had been claiming for 60 years. In 2018, the FDA approved a CBD-based drug called Epidiolex for 2 severe forms of childhood epilepsy, the same conditions ancient texts described as fits and falling sickness, treated with the same plant 3,000 years later. Cannabis compounds were found to have significant anti-inflammatory properties across multiple biological pathways. Chronic inflammation is now understood as a root driver of most major degenerative diseases, including heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. Laboratory studies have shown that certain cannabinoids can inhibit tumor cell growth and trigger programmed cell death in cancer cell lines. These findings are published in peer-reviewed journals, but clinical trials remain difficult because cannabis is a Schedule I controlled substance, a classification established in 1970 that has never been formally revised despite decades of contradictory evidence. The wasting disease connection came full circle with the AIDS crisis. Patients losing dangerous amounts of weight found that cannabis was one of the only things that allowed them to eat. The FDA's response was to approve a synthetic THC capsule called Marinol in 1985. Synthetic. Patentable. Not the plant. The plant remains illegal. The synthetic version of one of its compounds is approved medicine. If that sentence does not tell you something, read it again. Chapter 7. The question. Nobody in the industry wants to answer. Approximately 80% of the world's population still relies on plant-based medicine as primary care. not as a supplement, as primary care, because pharmaceutical medicine is priced out of reach for most of humanity. The plants work. The evidence is not anecdotal. It is accumulated across thousands of years of human observation in cultures with strong incentives to be accurate, because wrong medicine killed people. The mainstream answer is progress. Science advanced. We moved beyond folk remedies. But that answer requires ignoring that the medicine that replaced them has not cured cancer, not cured Alzheimer's, not resolved most autoimmune disease, and is priced in a way that makes it inaccessible to the majority of the planet. The Tartarian researchers who look at this history see a civilization that had already solved many of these problems through a deep relationship with the natural world, and whose knowledge was systematically dismantled across the 19th and early 20th centuries, leaving most of humanity dependent on a medical system that requires continuous payment to a small number of corporate entities. Whether you accept that full framework or not, the documented history is real. The names are real, the dates are real, the funding sources are real. A plant used medicinally for at least 5,000 years was made illegal in a generation, using fabricated stories, legislative sleight of hand, and captured regulatory bodies by interests who stood to profit from its absence. That happened. It is in the record. Outro. The endocannabinoid system in your body was not discovered in 1992. It was only named in 1992. It has been there for as long as human beings have existed. And for most of human history, people knew to work with it. They did not know the receptor names, but they knew the plant worked and they used it, generation after generation, across every culture on Earth. That knowledge was not lost. It was removed by people with names, documented financial interests, and a clear motive. The consequences are still playing out in hospitals, pharmacies, and the bodies of people who cannot afford treatment for conditions a plant might address. You do not have to accept the full Tartarian framework to find that disturbing. You just have to read the dates, drop a comment and tell me what buried history you want to look at next. If you are watching from outside the United States, I want to know whether you see the same pattern in your country's medical history. The answers are always in the record. You just have to know where to look.